Welcome back to CBS News, continuing coverage of the 50th anniversary of D-Day. We're on the American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, just above Omaha Beach. But there are ceremonies that are going on in America today as well, and we want to go back and check in with Paula Zahn in New York. Good morning again, Paula.
Good morning, Harry. Thanks. Well, the ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery are just about to get underway. We're going to show you a shot now of a concert that's taking place leading up to the service, which is expected to start in the next half hour or so. Right now, we're going to go to National Security Correspondent David Martin, who is standing by. David, you have a whole host of speakers, including Vice President Al Gore, who will take to the podium eventually this morning. What else might we expect?
Well, I think we're going to hear some more of that big band music played by the U.S. Army Band. Right now, the speaker is the actor Charles Durning, who was a private in World War II and was one of the first ashore at Omaha Beach. He will be conducting the ceremonies and, among other things, introducing Vice President Gore. We're told that in his remarks, Vice President Gore is going to mention a number of women who were instrumental in the buildup back home. They worked in the Baltimore Naval Shipyard, building the hundreds and hundreds of naval craft that were part of the vast armada that went over to Europe during the war. And that is, of course, the theme of this entire ceremony here, the home front. And in keeping with that, this is a much more upbeat ceremony than what you might expect, and I think certainly much more upbeat than the solemn ceremonies that are going on in Europe.
Over the past couple of days, we have seen President Clinton everywhere with heads of state, with veterans, with American GIs. In fact, it's the first time in his presidency he has been visible for a sustained period in his role as Commander-in-Chief. In a setting provided by the White House, I spoke with Mr. Clinton on a hangar deck aboard the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS George Washington. I've been talking with a lot of veterans, and a lot of them respect you as Commander-in-Chief. Some of them aren't so sure. Do you feel like you have something to prove to them?
No more than to any other Americans, except I think that the veterans of this country are entitled to know that what they fought for in the Second World War is not going to be squandered at the end of the Cold War. Now people are having a lot of questions about, well, what's our national defense for? How do we keep our prestige alive, and what's our job now in the world? It is a difficult and different world, and what I owe them is to make sure that we always have a strong, well-prepared, well-motivated, highly supported military, and that we move to contain the chaos and madness that is still abroad in the world and limit it so that our very existence is not again threatened by alien powers, and so we never again have to do a D-Day. I owe them that, and I'm going to do my best to pay them.
Do you feel comfortable in your role as Commander-in-Chief?
Oh, yes. I worked very hard at it. I spent an awful lot of time with the service chiefs. I've spent a good deal of time out and around with the various services. I have tried to get to know pretty well a lot of the officers who have to make recommendations on policies and then have to carry them out. The lives of these men on this ship are very precious to me, and I'm well aware that if I send them out into harm's way, I need to be as right as God will let me be right, and that this enormous power the United States has now has its limits and its possibilities, and clearly its responsibilities.
It is hard to be in Europe now during this time, especially in the places that you've been and the places you will go, and not do some soul searching. Have you been doing some?
Sure, I think we all have. I think everybody who's been part of this experience is still overwhelmed by the magnitude of the effort, by the level of courage and will that was required to prevail. And it's made me think more deeply, more soberly, more prayerfully even, about the responsibilities that I have now and the problems that we're facing now.
Has it made you think or reconsider at all your own of service during the Vietnam War?
Not in that way, not in the way you ask it. I thought then, based on what I knew then, and I knew quite a bit for a person my age because I'd studied a lot of the documents, that our involvement was in error and that I should try to do what I could honorably to oppose it and to change it. I still believe that. But I think that military service is an honorable thing, and it's something that, in that sense, I wish I had experienced. None of us can control the time and place in which we live and the kinds of things that happen. We can only control our reaction to it. At the time, I did the best I could. And you know, of course, from what came out, that I had very mixed feelings about it. I tried to get myself even back into the draft because I was so confused about it. But I did the best I could at that time, and I'm doing the best I can now. One of the things that I think we learned from that war is that even when we are extremely well motivated, heroic, and willing to die in large numbers, we cannot win a fight for someone else. We can support other people on their own land fighting for their own destiny, but we can't win a fight for someone else. There are limits to what we can do. And the enormous reaction after that war happened and after the South Vietnamese forces collapsed 10 days after our final withdrawal almost caused our country to go into a shell for a while. And that was also bad. First we overreached, and then we didn't do perhaps what we should have done to sort of stick a stake in the ground. And what I'm determined to do is to learn as much as I can from history, but not be imprisoned by it, and certainly not be bogged down by it. I have a job to do now, and nobody else in the world has it but me. And one thing I owe these people who are in the armed services is to get up every day and do it the very best I can.
Conversation with President Clinton that I had with him yesterday aboard the USS George Washington.
It is my special privilege and great honor to present the President of the United States.
So that's the end of the speech. Whoa.
Mr. Dawson, you did your men proud today. General Shalikashvili, Mr. Cronkite, Chaplain, distinguished leaders of our government, members of Congress, members of the armed services, our hosts from France, and most of all, our veterans, their families, and their friends. In these last days of ceremonies, we have heard wonderful words of tribute. Now we come to this hallowed place that speaks more than anything else in silence. Here on this quiet plateau, on this small piece of American soil, we honor those who gave their lives for us 50 crowded years ago. Today, the beaches of Normandy are calm. If you walk these shores on a summer's day, all you might hear is the laughter of children playing on the sand, or the cry of seagulls overhead, or perhaps the ringing of a distant church bell. The simple sounds of freedom barely breaking the silence. Peaceful sounds. Ordinary sounds. But June 6, 1944, was the least ordinary day of the 20th century. On that chill dawn, these beaches echoed with the sounds of staccato gunfire, the roar of aircraft, the thunder of bombardment. And through the wind and the waves came the soldiers out of their landing craft and into the water, away from their youth and toward a savage place many of them would sadly never leave. They had come to free a continent. The Americans, the British, the Canadians, the Poles, the French resistance, the Norwegians, and others. They had all come to stop one of the greatest forces of evil the world has ever known. As news of the invasion broke, back home in America, people held their breath. In Boston, commuters stood reading the news on the electric sign at South Station. In New York, the Statue of Liberty, its torch blacked out since Pearl Harbor, was lit at sunset for 15 minutes. And in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, a young mother named Pauline Elliott wrote to her husband, Frank, a corporal in the Army, "D-Day has arrived. The first thought of all of us was a prayer." Below us are the beaches where Corporal Elliott's battalion and so many other Americans landed. Omaha and Utah, proud names from America's heartland, part of the biggest gamble of the war, the greatest crusade. Yes, the longest day. During those first hours on bloody Omaha, nothing seemed to go right. Landing craft were ripped apart by mines and shells. Tanks sent to protect them had sunk, drowning their crews. Enemy fire raked the invaders as they stepped into chest-high water and waded past the floating bodies of their comrades. And as the stunned survivors of the first wave huddled behind a seawall, it seemed the invasion might fail. Hitler and his followers had bet on it. They were sure the Allied soldiers were soft, weakened by liberty and leisure, by the mingling of races and religion. They were sure their totalitarian youth had more discipline and zeal. But then something happened. Although many of the American troops found themselves without officers on unfamiliar ground, next to soldiers they didn't know, one by one, they got up. They inched forward, and together, in groups of 3s and 5s and 10s, the sons of democracy improvised and mounted their own attacks. At that exact moment, on these beaches, the forces of freedom turned the tide of the 20th century. These soldiers knew that staying put meant certain death, but they were also driven by the voice of free will and responsibility, nurtured in Sunday schools, town halls, and sandlot ball games. The voice that told them to stand up and move forward, saying, "You can do it, and if you don't, no one else will." And as Captain Joe Dawson led his company up this bluff, and as others followed his lead, they secured a foothold for freedom. Today, many of them are here among us. Oh, they may walk with a little less spring in their step, and their ranks are growing thinner. But let us never forget, when they were young, these men saved the world. And so let us now ask them, all the veterans of the Normandy campaign, to stand if they can and be recognized. The freedom they fought for was no abstract concept. It was the stuff of their daily lives. Listen to what Frank Elliott had written to his wife from the embarkation point in England. I miss hamburgers a la Coney Island, American beer a la Duquesne, American shows a la Penn Theater, and American girls a la you. Pauline Elliott wrote back on June 6th as she and their one-year-old daughter listened on the radio. Little Deronda is the only one not affected by D-Day news. I hope and pray she will never remember any of this, but only the happiness of the hours that will follow her daddy's homecoming step on the porch. Well, millions of our GIs did return home from that war to build up our nations and enjoy life's sweet pleasures. But on this field, there are 9,386 who did not. 33 pairs of brothers, a father and his son, 11 men from tiny Bedford, Virginia, and Corporal Frank Elliott, killed near these bluffs by a German shell on D-Day. They were the fathers we never knew, the uncles we never met, the friends who never returned, the heroes we can never repay. They gave us our world. And those simple sounds of freedom we hear today are their voices speaking to us across the years. At this place, let us honor all the Americans who lost their lives in World War II. Let us remember as well that over 40 million human beings from every side perished, soldiers on the field of battle, Jews in the ghettos and death camps, civilians ravaged by shell fire and famine. May God give rest to all their souls. 50 years later, what a different world we live in. Germany, Japan, and Italy, liberated by our victory, now stand among our closest allies and the staunchest defenders of freedom. Russia, decimated during the war and frozen afterward in communism and Cold War, has been reborn in democracy. And as freedom rings from Prague to Kiev, the liberation of this continent is nearly complete. Now the question falls to our generation. How will we build upon the sacrifice of D-Day's heroes? Like the soldiers of Omaha Beach, we cannot stand still. We cannot stay safe by doing so. Avoiding today's problems would be our own generation's appeasement. For just as freedom has a price, it also has a purpose, and its name is progress. Today, our mission is to expand freedom's reach farther, to tap the full potential of each of our own citizens, to strengthen our families, our faith, and our communities, to fight indifference and intolerance, to keep our nation strong, and to light the lives of those still dwelling in the darkness of undemocratic rule. Our parents did that and more. We must do nothing less. They struggled in war so that we might strive in peace. We know that progress is not inevitable, but neither was victory upon these beaches.